Now,
Okay, let me this is great, and I want to continue, but I think this is a good point to interject her first question. By the way, this from this Ukrainian journalist, because it's about Crimea. It says, she tells me to have fun with you, and then she says, "I'd like you to challenge him on Ukraine's neutrality. He often talks about Ukraine needing to be neutral to satisfy Russia, but you could remind him that Ukraine was neutral in 2014 when Russia decided to annex Crimea and invade the eastern part of the country. As it was still neutral in 2022 when the full-scale invasion began, despite so-called security guarantees from Russia under the Budapest Memorandum. Why would neutrality work now when history shows it hasn't stopped Russian aggression?" And he says, "Is this naivete or a lie?" I'd like you to tell him that when he describes this war as a proxy conflict, he erases Ukraine's agency. Ukrainians have made it clear that they reject Russian occupation and don't want neutrality. How does he reconcile his stance with their right to self-determination? So, okay, respond to
yeah,
that.
in my world, I don't know if it's absolutely true in physics, but temporal priority usually determines causation. And in the case of Crimea, the first event was the coup. The second event was Crimea. If Putin had seized Crimea and then there was a coup, that would be quite a different history. But what happened was there was a coup, and then immediately after Crimea. So I just find that not exactly to the point.
Okay. Correlation doesn't prove causation, but on the other hand, the order of events is significant. Okay, so in any case, that's good. I wanted you to at least
Yeah.
respond to that. Go on.
And by the way, when it comes to agency, uh, sad to say, the agency that Ukraine should have used, but it didn't know how because it doesn't have enough experience, especially of the United States. The agency should have been to say to the United States, thank you, but we're on our own, please.
Okay.
Because I quoted to them the old adage of Henry Kissinger that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And I tried to tell them, you're going to get in a hell of a lot of trouble if you go down this path. You're going to get wrecked. And the United States wrecks countries for a living under the guise of saving them. So we're not saving Ukraine. And no, Ukraine has the right to ask for NATO membership. But
Yeah.
if the United States has any sanity and prudence, it should explain to the Ukrainians, for your sake and ours, the answer is no, thank you. And so it's not Ukraine's right to choose NATO. It's the United States' absolute responsibility to tell Ukraine we're not going down that path. And
Okay.
truly, yes, okay, Cuba had the right, perhaps, to say to the Soviet Union in 1961, 62, sure, come station your offensive nuclear weapons here. But
Yeah.
if Khrushchev had been more clear thinking at the time, he would have said, Fidel, this isn't going to work out well.
Yeah.
So we think it's not a good idea. Unfortunately, Ukraine, like many inexperienced countries, loves the United States and trusts the United States. And when a president of the United States says, we have your back, oh my God, it's hard to resist. I keep telling them, they say they have your back, but they don't have your front. You're going to get shot in the front. And that's what's happened. It's been 600 or 700,000 dead Ukrainians, and for
Exactly.
nothing, because they're losing on the battlefield. And it's completely predictable. And I predicted it precisely. I have to say almost precisely, because I told them repeatedly, don't get into this. And then in the spring of 2022, to their great dismay, even disgust, I said, stop this, negotiate this. This will not end well if you continue in this direction. They said, oh, you're a Putin apologist and so forth. I said, no, I'm a friend of Ukraine. I want to save you before this gets worse.
Well, okay. Before I respond, I respond with two more of her questions, but this is a great summary. There were two other issues that, at the same time, that are in a global context, which are probably relevant to Russia's attitude about security guarantees and the ability to work with the West. The walking out of the International Nuclear Force Treaty and the Iran nuclear weapons treaties in 2018, 2019 were both examples of which I think you've argued, and I think I agree with you, suggests that the United States is not um, willing to be a fair player, I guess, when it comes to international treaties.
Yeah, let me say there's a third one extremely direct and relevant for this, which is that when Lugansk and Donetsk broke away in 2014, a war ensued, and Russia helped to broker a peace agreement between Ukraine and these two breakaway regions that became the Minsk I and then the Minsk II agreements. And the idea of the Minsk II agreement wasn't that Russia would annex these territories or that they would lead Ukraine, but rather that they would have autonomy because they were the ethnically Russian regions in the far eastern part of Ukraine. And not only was that agreement signed, but it was ratified by the UN Security Council afterwards. So it had full backing by the Security Council.
What date was that?
Minsk II was 2015.
Okay.
Yeah. And with Minsk II, the Germans and the French were to be the guarantors of Minsk II in something that they called the Normandy process. Now, I happen to know that the U.S. and the Ukrainians blew it off. And the U.S. attitude was, you don't have to take that seriously. And the Ukrainian attitude was, well, we only signed at gunpoint. We're not going to honor this treaty. So here is a UN Security Council-backed treaty guaranteed by France and Germany, and it was completely unobserved. Quite the contrary, the U.S. started flooding Ukraine with big weapon systems during the Trump period, by the way, and Minsk was completely ignored. And the Russians didn't just forget about it. They kept saying, Minsk II, Minsk II, Minsk II. Ukraine, among other things, was supposed to put into the Constitution the autonomy of these eastern regions. Well, it was completely rejected. And that was another example alongside the U.S. walking out of the Iran agreement, the JCPOA, which it notified in 2017, did in 2018, I believe. And then the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which the Trump administration walked out of in 2019. And Biden, tired. Putin had a very astute observation in an interview in Figaro, the French newspaper, in 2017. And he said, as of 2017, he said, I've dealt with 3 presidents by now. You know, they come into office with some ideas, but then men in dark suits and blue ties show up and explain to the presidents the way things really are. And you never hear of those ideas again, said Putin. And so Putin's view was, yeah, the United States is not serious. They treat us like shit, if you'll excuse me. They don't honor any agreements. They don't respect us. We don't have, we're told repeatedly, we have no say in anything. By the way, we didn't even discuss the Iraq War, an ally of Russia, the Syrian war caused by the United States, an ally of Russia, the NATO destruction of Muammar Gaddafi's government in 2011, NATO once again. So Putin took a rather jaundiced view by the end of all of this, by ABM, just chronologically, anti-ballistic missile treaty, 7 countries joining NATO in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia. 2008, invitation to Georgia and Ukraine. 2014, a coup that brings down Yanukovych. 2011, two wars started by the United States for regime change operations. 2017, abandoning JCPOA. 2019, abandoning Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. And this brings us up to 2021 because Biden comes into office and at the end of 2021, on December 15th, Putin puts on the table a document which you can find online. The title is roughly Draft Russia-U.S. Security Agreement.
Yeah.
And
That's what I heard.
I read it immediately, and I called the White House and I said, negotiate. You got the makings of a deal here. Because the core of what Putin was saying was the same for the preceding quarter century was stop NATO enlargement. And I talked to Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and said, Jake, take the deal. Come on. And he said, no, there won't be a war. And NATO's not going to enlarge. And I said, oh, NATO's not going to enlarge, but you're going to have a war for something that's not going to happen? He said, no, it's our open door policy. I said, Jake, there's no such thing as an open door policy for military bases. Come on, get real. Anyway, they did not get real. Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, reported that in January 2022, Blinken told Lavrov, that is the U.S. Secretary of State, told the Russian foreign minister that the U.S. reserves the right to put missile systems into Ukraine. Even that, not just NATO membership, but specifically missile systems, telling Lavrov that's our prerogative. It's not your business. So this is when the SMO, the Special Military Operation, was launched on February 24th, 2022. And within a week, Zelensky says publicly, okay, neutrality. And the Russians say, okay, let's negotiate. And the Turkish foreign ministry says, we'll mediate, and talks open up in Ankara. And I flew to Ankara, not during the negotiations, but immediately afterwards, because I wanted to be briefed on what happened. And they actually reached an agreement, to the point of initially an agreement. And then the United States stepped in and told Zelensky, fight on. And in fact, that was the time that our Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, publicly stated something that he probably regretted stating, but he told the truth, which in Washington is called the Washington gaffe, when a truth accidentally escapes your lips. And he said, our purpose is to weaken Russia, not to secure Ukraine, but to weaken Russia. Okay, so he told him, continue fighting. And Boris Johnson, who is a fool, but was actually the Prime Minister of the UK, went to Kiev in April 2022 and told them, you have to keep fighting. We don't support neutrality. And then later, Boris Johnson said, and again, it's he told a glimmer of the truth. He said, we have to win this. This is Western hegemony at stake. In other words, this isn't about Ukraine. This is the game of risk. If anyone's played it, the U.S. wants its piece on every spot of the board. And, Risk is a great game. It's a lot of fun. You played it 50 years ago.
Oh, I hate it because you always end up hating everyone else in the game.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, at least as you roll the dice and you take your little token off the board, this is real life. But they're playing that game.
Now, I'm really intrigued. I heard you'd gone to Turkey. And, this, one doesn't hear about this, but there is documented evidence that there was basically an agreement that was initialed. Do we have access to that agreement?
Parts of it have been published. And also Naftali Bennett, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, was informally a kibitzer or mediator as well. And he gave a remarkable several-hour bantering interview where he said, yeah, and then at the last minute they stopped it, meaning the United States. And the interviewer is kind of shocked, and Bennett says, look, I'm just an Israeli prime minister. It's not my business what they do. I was just an intermediary, and I can't second guess the United States. But yeah, they stopped it. They said it would look weak to China. They're playing games, really playing games, game theory games. They're not solving problems.
Okay, and that's okay. This is a great summary of the Jeffrey Sachs summary of the situation up to the war and ongoing, and the 600,000 deaths at least, if not more, and
Yeah, we
probably
don't have the
underreported.
accurate count, but that's a plausible count.
Yeah, plausible count. You said that I'm sympathetic because I found something similar, but the New York Times stopped publishing your statements on this. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, they never publish my statements on Ukraine,
Never.
period, because they started from the beginning in February 24th, 2022. This is the start, and it's because Putin's a madman, and and he's got the Peter the Great complex, and he's trying to recreate the Russian Empire. Just a kind of fantasy story that kind of juvenile PR narrative. And the New York Times is prone to that, but it went on and on for a year. And I asked a research assistant, you get on the website and count how many opinion pieces use the word unprovoked to define the war, whether it was an editorial or an op-ed. And my research assistant found 26 articles in the first year that defined it as unprovoked. So I called the editor and I said, look, this is ridiculous. And could we have an honest grown-up discussion about this? And after 3 months, we did get on the line with a group of the editors, and I described the evidence, and they said, well, we'll agree to disagree. And I said, okay, let me have 700 words. And I don't even care if it's in print. I just put it on a website. The marginal cost of that is, I think, precisely zero, or if not precisely zero, it's got a lot of zeros after the decimal point. And they wouldn't run it.
Wow.
And they haven't run anything since. They called me again on another issue, and I told them what I wanted to write, and then the guy called back and said, well, our editors don't want to go that way.
Yeah. No, I've had them do.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, look, before I'm going to get to our other two questions, this is a good, but let me just ask you to prognosticate right now, as I will in a minute about Israel too. But so the situation, what do you see happening with the new Trump administration? Well, forget Trump per se. What do you see happening in Ukraine? We'll talk about Trump more detail in a bit. But
every day, Ukrainians are losing maybe 2,000 lives, dead and seriously wounded. So it's just terrible what's going on.
What about Russians?
Of course, Russians are also losing a lot of people, but Russia has a big artillery advantage. It's got air superiority. It's got missile superiority. And so the deaths are much lower, but they're significant, no doubt. But Ukraine is kind of bled out. And they don't have enough reinforcements. And so the Russians are basically making breakthroughs across almost the entire contact line, which is 1,000 kilometers.
I was intrigued to hear about these North Koreans coming. I mean, one gets this, at least the media make it seem like Russian army's drained and they had to get North Koreans to help out. You want to comment on that?
Well, first of all wars have an info war aspect to them. And I try to listen to Russian side media as well as American side media every day. I spend actually, a couple of hours a day systematically listening to both sides. And in terms of mainstream media, of course, overwhelmingly Western. But I very carefully look at websites that are pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, U.S. mainstream media, and so forth. And my take is that that Russia is really doing grave damage to Ukraine with a significant force superiority. And when it comes to the North Koreans, actually, there's an order capture at least one, show us one. And so far,
Okay.
that hasn't happened. So, whatever is the real story there, we haven't seen anything. There's a lot of propaganda. A
Yeah.
lot of the propaganda on the US side comes from organizations that are paid for by the military, literally, arms contractors that
Mhm.
fund think tanks and so forth. So you have to triangulate this in the sense of listening to all different sides. And my view is that the Ukrainians are losing badly, and that's understandable because
What's
they're much
next?
smaller, much
Sure,
weaker.
it's hard to imagine. I mean, a priori,
Yes,
it's like Canada trying to fight U.S. I mean,
that's right. That's
it's
exactly right.
it, it,
And the NATO superiority myth, it turns out eh, we didn't have stockpiles and warehouses of filled with the 155 millimeter artillery shells and other basics because the wars that the United States had fought were much shorter term. They weren't prolonged ground wars and so forth. And so I think we're watching a war of attrition, and the Ukrainians have been attrited, and it's pretty devastating.
so without diplomacy, you just what do you foresee?
Well, if there's no diplomacy, just a lot more suffering from Ukraine, and if Western leaders get really desperate because their honor is on the line, their reputation is on the line, they already escalated last month, crossing another one of the U.S. self-imposed red lines that Ukraine could not strike deep inside Russia. They gave that up. And the Russians have said, you've really crossed a big one right now. And we say typically, oh, these just bluffing. We can do what we want until kablooey. And so either the Russians uh, continue to win, which is the most likely scenario, or the idiots on the Western side escalate to trigger a nuclear war, which is not inconceivable.
So okay, I mean, there's a lot of statements that this could trigger a nuclear war, and Putin has
Of
talked
course it
about it,
could.
and
And
yeah.
the answer of the answer of the United States is don't worry about it. And anyone that ever tells you don't worry about a nuclear war, you should classify into the category of absolutely insane or lying through their teeth, because you should worry about it every single day.
Yeah, it's the
And by the
biggest.
way, I like to quote President John F. Kennedy in this, and I will quote him because I just grabbed it on my phone.
I figured you
Uh,
were going for something good.
yeah,
Okay.
he said, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And we do exactly the opposite of what Kennedy advised.
Although
Every
at the
day is
although with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he kind of did that too, right? He basically forced a retreat, right? But anyway, that's a
no, no,
different.
no, but not a humiliating retreat in the sense that in the end, the U.S., I mean, it's actually a very interesting, complicated story. We'll do another show about that. I actually wrote a book about that, but I'm going to avoid that question
Oh,
right
I'd
now.
love to. Okay,
Yeah,
good. Okay, I'd love to learn. But okay,
yeah.
well, and it's absolutely true that it's, and in fact, in some sense, well, we've talked about this before, but and of course, with my background in the bulletin and the doomsday clock, the not we violate the not have violated the non-proliferation treaty every day since it's been signed, because one of the requirements is that the nuclear countries are supposed to eventually disarm, or at least
Exactly.
go in that direction, and not encourage proliferation within or outside. And that's exactly the opposite of what's going on.
That's exactly right. You know, our whole approach is what J. William Fulbright, when he was chairman of the Senate Council on Foreign Relations, called the arrogance of power, which is we can do what we want. We can't. Even when we were so much more powerful, we couldn't do what we wanted. We lost a lot of wars. We had all sorts of terrible outcomes. But now we don't even have that kind of preponderance of power because, frankly, the technology has spread. Russia is very powerful militarily. China is very powerful militarily. We need to learn actually to deal with each other in a way that doesn't get us all killed.